To begin with, I want to tell you an old Soviet joke from the Brezhnev era. A man comes to a newspaper kiosk, picks up Pravda, looks at the front page, and puts it back without buying it. And he does this every morning. After a few weeks, the seller couldn't take it and asked what he wanted, an obituary. But obituaries are always printed on the last page. The one I'm waiting for will be on the front page. You already understand what we're going to talk about in this video. About the one who imagined himself as the next gatherer of Russian lands and, disregarding all norms of international law and common sense, unleashed a bloody war in the very center of Europe, the likes of which hasn't been seen in the last 80 years. The one who turned Russia from a corrupt pseudo-democracy into a tightly centralized Chekist mafia dictatorship where the life of an ordinary person is devalued for the sake of imperial ambitions, not for the goosebumps of its immortal Führer. But still, the central topic will be Russia after Putin, so what will happen to it? What will happen to the system that former KGB lieutenant colonel has been so carefully building for more than 25 years? Will it collapse like Sauron's castle after the destruction of the Ring of Power? Or, on the contrary, will it become even stronger? Will the Russian Federation embark on the path of reforms and democratization, and what should Ukraine and the whole world expect then? I will base my analysis exclusively on the available facts, centuries of historical experience, and the peculiarities of the current structure of the Russian state apparatus. On my channel, there is only scientifically based knowledge, so fans of various tarot readers, warlocks, and molfars, please kindly move along. And for those who enjoy thinking things through, you are most welcome. And yes, everything here will be as realistic as possible, with no rose-colored glasses. My name is Semyon, this is Nikashu TV, and now we move into the world of the near future, into a Russia without Putin. The question of the transfer of power. In order to predict the most realistic scenarios for the future development of the Russian Federation without Putin, we first need to understand a few objective points. First of all, the weak point of absolutely all dictatorships without exception is the question of the transfer of power, the problem of succession to the throne. Unlike Western-style democratic states, where the procedure for transferring power is set out in law or at least exists as an unwritten tradition, dictatorships primarily rely on the personal authority of a specific leader. This also sets a dictatorship apart from classic absolute monarchies. After all, personal charisma and influence over society can't simply be passed on by inheritance or by decree without undermining the stability of the system itself. After all, someone like Louis XV didn't have to prove to anyone why he, and not someone else, should occupy the French throne. His power was considered sacred and for many centuries was passed exclusively from father to son, or sometimes from grandfather to grandson. It doesn't work that way with modern dictatorships. Even the dictator's son, who essentially inherited the position, still has to literally prove his own strength and authority to those around him. He has to show that he's no worse than his father, or even better.
Лучше и жестче.
For example, the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, or as he's often called, Kim III. He inherited power from his father, Kim II, but in order to prove his right to dominate the state and the party, he carried out purges among the ruling elite in the first years of his rule. The culmination was the arrest and execution of the dictator's uncle, Jang Song-taek, in December 2013, who was previously considered the second most important figure in North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He accused his precious relative of attempting a coup, corruption, and anti-party activities. And he called his execution a cleansing of the party from filth. Putin has no sons, and if he has any by Alina Kabaeva or other mistresses, they are unlikely to have reached the age necessary to effectively govern a super-centralized state. And even if by the time the little stitched-up man dies they grow up to about 25, it will be impossible for them to simply take power into their own hands, because Putin's inner circle simply won't allow it. Those are some old wolves. Don't give them an inch or they'll take your whole arm. For Putin's supposed sons to have any chance at all, they need to be prepared for ruling right now, without waiting for old age. Just like Lukashenko has been raising his beloved Kolya almost from the cradle and takes him everywhere with him around the world. Or like the president of Syria, Hafez Assad, or Heydar Aliyev of Azerbaijan did. They prepared their sons in advance, appointing them to important government positions while they were still alive, so that the entire ruling elite, from the lowest ranks to the highest, would know exactly who the heir is and wouldn't have a moment's doubt about whom they should bow to after the old leader passes away. So classic succession to the throne is definitely out of the question in Russia. Next point. In countries with long-standing democratic traditions, the transfer of power happens peacefully and without bloodshed. First and foremost, this is thanks to strong political and socio-political institutions. Among them, of course, the most important role is played by an independent parliament, as well as competing political parties, independent courts, influential public organizations, and free mass media. None of this exists in Russia, or if it does, it exists only for show. After all dictators deliberately weaken such structures so that they cannot in any way limit their power. As a result, when the time for succession comes, there is no reliable platform for a peaceful and predictable transfer of power. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was no clearly defined and functioning mechanism of succession in the USSR. The resulting power vacuum led to an extremely fierce behind-the-scenes struggle between Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev. The outcome of this struggle was decided not by voting, but solely by the forcible removal of a rival through the arrest and execution of Lavrenti Pavlovich. In addition to this point, it can be added that Gennady is often afraid of strong successors, seeing them as a threat of a coup even during his own lifetime. That is why he surrounds himself with grey, silent mediocrities, or purges the political landscape as much as possible, making it, so to speak, sterile. This is exactly what Stalin did, and Putin does the same, only the former's methods were much harsher. Basically, it's just cosplay. There are also several important details that might not be immediately noticeable. In a dictatorship, power is usually maintained either by the leader's charisma or by a complex balance of power among elite groups that are personally loyal to the dictator. Therefore, as soon as the leader passes away, the necessary arbiter disappears. Thus, after the death of Francisco Franco in Spain in 1975, the system he had built over decades began to be rapidly dismantled. Even though he himself appointed King Juan Carlos I as his official successor, the country almost immediately set a course for democratization, since the old mechanism stopped working without Franco's presence. Moreover, almost any dictatorship is a rather shaky coalition of security forces, oligarchs, and bureaucrats. As long as the dictator is alive, they are forced to cooperate with each other. As soon as he disappears, a war of everyone against everyone begins for supreme power and redistribution of resources. For example, after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, members of the so-called Gang of Four, Mao's closest associates, were arrested. And the course of the state's development radically changed thanks to the well-thought-out policies of Deng Xiaoping. And one final point is the distinctly Russian nature of the state. Almost all of history shows that a change of power is almost always a point of bifurcation and instability. For example, after the death of Peter I, due to the lack of a clear mechanism for succession to the throne, for almost 100 years, any change of power was accompanied by violence or crisis. And Soviet totalitarianism, despite its outward strength and monolithic nature, was never able to institutionalize succession. Therefore, the choice of General Secretary was always decided by behind-the-scenes power struggles among top party factions. And once again about Putin's model of governance, it is built entirely around the figure of the supreme arbiter. The Federal Assembly, the courts, and the government do not possess independent authority. After all, over the past year, a system has developed that is rotten at its core, where loyalty is more important than competence and personal connections matter more than institutions. This makes any future transfer of power extremely dependent on subjective factors, which is a classic sign of the vulnerability of a personalist regime like Putin's. Ultimately, our new gatherer of Russian lands deliberately avoids naming a clear successor, prolonging his personal power, but in doing so, he accumulates risks, instability, and even turmoil for the future, including in the not-so-distant future.
Будущее.
How might Putin leave? This factor will also have a significant impact on the choice of Russia's future development path. And I'll say right away that I don't want to even consider the idea that Putin will rule until the end of his constitutional term in 2030 or 2036 and then hand over power to his successor. The scenario where Putin suddenly announces the well-known phrase, "I'm leaving," and then spends the rest of his days peacefully fishing somewhere in Altai has zero chance. He's not the kind of person to let go of power, even when his hands are already old and sometimes shaking. No, most likely when his term ends, the terms will just be reset again, if by that time the elderly dwarf is still able to multiply anything by 0. A new Tereshkova will appear, and an obedient State Duma, which will rewrite the rules again, or at the very least they'll come up with some new position for Putin. Like Elbasi in Kazakhstan, or they'll call him the father of the nation, or something like in Iran. There's a president, but above him is the supreme leader and spiritual head of the nation. In a word, they'll somehow legalize such blatant lawlessness. Is it the first time or something? So, as far as I'm concerned, only 3 scenarios are realistic, as they say. Putin, and the first of them is that Putin will rule until his biological death. And then he'll either be buried or maybe even embalmed, like Lenin was back in the day. They'll put him next to the mausoleum on Red Square and make everyone come and bow, just like they used to do with young pioneers. Maybe, under the cover of all this, they'll even remove Vladimir Ilyich's mummy, and only the ashes of Vladimir Vladimirovich will remain, and at the main entrance, instead of the inscription Lenin, it will just say Putin. And look, they don't even need to change the last 2 letters, it's like it was made to order. But seriously, the scenario of Putin ruling for life seems to me the most objectively justified. After all, the state machine he created is in essence a universal classic for personalist regimes. The leader holds everything in his hands as long as he's alive. That is, a system of this type is built exclusively on personal loyalty, and since the current Russian elite, for the most part, is terrified of losing their influence and billions in secret accounts. And in the event of their alpha male's death, they will naturally do everything possible to ensure the leader rules for as long as possible. The second scenario is the opposite of the first. In that sense, at some point, the ruling elite comes to a clear and irreversible realization that things are generally better without Putin than with him, and they remove him. A typical conspiracy and Kremlin coup which Russian history is already full of. For example, the entire 18th century was a continuous era of palace coups, where changes of power were almost always accompanied by violence. But it's important to note that the leader changed, not the system itself. That state machine, formed during the reign of Peter I, basically existed without any significant changes all the way until the revolution of 1917. The top leaders replaced each other, but the autocratic tyranny remained unshakable. The same thing could very well happen with Putin. So, roughly speaking, the old man died, but his body didn't, and it would actually be better the other way around. By the way, Putin's further fate after being overthrown is of little interest. A disgraced boss is no longer a boss, he simply becomes expendable material for history. In turn, the factors that could most obviously push Putin's inner circle to turn against their own little czar are simply banal. Historical experience allows us to formulate their list quite accurately: a sharp decrease in resources necessary for personal enrichment. A threat to personal safety, for example, fear of inevitable dismissal or arrest, a major military defeat that even seasoned propaganda won't be able to present as a victory. And in general, the dictator's loss of control over the state, for example, due to a serious illness or simply progressing senile dementia. As you can see, under such an autocratic regime, the Russian Chekist mafia nomenclatura will pay the least attention to the opinions and needs of the general public and will be guided solely by their own selfish interests. If everything is good and life is sweet, then they stand firmly behind Putin. But if the aging Führer causes more problems than achievements, then they might just stab him in the back. Politics is like that, it's ruthless. Machiavellianism in its purest form. And finally, the third scenario, the one everyone loves and expects. As Pushkin described it 200 years ago, the Russian revolt is senseless and merciless. That is, mass popular protests with the prospect of escalating into an armed uprising and even a full-fledged revolution, similar to the infamous events of 1917. And then, the weakening and possibly even the collapse of the Russian state into separate territorial entities. I analyzed in detail in a separate video which specific Russian regions could be the first to leave the Russian Federation. I recommend everyone to watch it. Naturally, from an emotional point of view, for almost all Ukrainians, except perhaps for the so-called fifth column, such a scenario is obvious and expected. So that the enraged and half-starved Russian people would rise up against the Tsar, drag Putin out of his warm Kremlin office, and hang him by his private parts on Red Square. By the way, that's exactly what the grateful citizens of Italy did with the corpse of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, only they hung him by his feet in the main square of Milan. In short, the option where the people themselves overthrow the one they so loyally voted for seems to me the most just and proper. But unfortunately, justice in history is extremely rare and often takes on far from the most pleasant forms. All the more so because my channel isn't just for talking but for making people think. And logic and common sense suggest that the scenario of a popular uprising or revolution under the current circumstances inside the Russian Federation seems, if not completely impossible, then at least highly unlikely. The thing is, we Ukrainians, and Europeans in general, for some reason believe that if people suddenly take to the streets en masse and start demanding something, protesting, then the authorities will definitely waver, make concessions, or even run away somewhere, like Yanukovych did, fleeing to Rostov. This is quite a mistaken opinion. After all, for example, the mass protests in Belarus not so long ago in 2020, despite their scale and the obvious legitimacy of protesting against the blatant falsification of election results, were ultimately brutally suppressed. And why? Because the security apparatus remained absolutely loyal to its leader and at the critical moment did not refuse to carry out orders. They took up their batons, and not just their batons, and from there, things just escalated. That's why political scientists have long come up with a formula. The fate of a revolution is decided not in the streets, but in the barracks. In other words, the street crowds themselves are important as a catalyst. But the decisive factor is the behavior of the security forces. The army, the police, the National Guard, the FSB, as well as various special units, of which a whole lot have appeared during the years of Putin's rule. If they are loyal to the authorities and ready to use force, the protests will be suppressed regardless of their scale. If the security forces, especially their commanders, are passive, refuse to shoot at protesters, or even switch to the side of the rebels, then the regime will inevitably collapse even with a relatively small number of people on the streets. As an example, during the August coup of 1991, army generals refused to follow the orders of the State Committee on the State of Emergency to suppress the protests by force and clear the White House of Yeltsin's supporters. Or the 1917 revolution, when the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, instead of suppressing the protests, themselves joined the side of the rebels, making Nicholas II's abdication inevitable. Overall, an objective analysis allows us to draw a clear conclusion. In modern Russia, a purely popular uprising is highly unlikely due to the total control of the security forces, the threat of repression, and the lack of an organized opposition within the country itself. However, in the event of a total collapse, for example, a major military defeat or an economic crash similar to the Great Depression a century ago, the emergence of mass protests or regional uprisings is quite possible, which with a weakened security apparatus could well develop into a revolutionary scenario. This is the widely discussed turmoil and potential further breakup of the Russian Federation. Scenario 1: Autopilot. I'll start not with subjective reasoning, but with purely scientific knowledge. There is a very interesting field in sociology. It's called structural functionalism. To put it briefly, the idea is that any system, whether it's a small company, a fan club of some pop star, or a political regime, always and under any circumstances works primarily to maintain itself. So, it turns out that the main goal of any system is self-preservation, maintaining balance, and reproducing its own structure. For example, in some hypothetical ministry, a new department is created to fight, let's say, poverty. But over time, its main task becomes preserving jobs for officials and obtaining new funding, even if poverty has already been defeated or the methods of fighting it have become ineffective. Therefore, from a systems perspective, the survival of the system becomes more important than fulfilling its external tasks. And if the system stops spending resources on self-maintenance, it simply falls apart. Well, now let's extrapolate all this to Russian realities. Then an unambiguous but very disappointing conclusion suggests itself. The most likely scenario that awaits the Russian Federation without Putin is the inertial scenario. The Russian Federation will continue flying on autopilot, by preserving the existing system through a purely cosmetic change at the top. To put it as simply as possible, there will be a sort of collective Putin or Putinism without Putin, especially in the short and medium term. That is, for the next 5 to 10, or maybe even 20 years after Putin disappears from the historical stage. By the way, this scenario is universal regardless of whether Putin rules until his death or is overthrown, whether he manages to appoint his successor like Yeltsin did in '99 or not. A struggle for access to the throne will immediately begin. In this scenario, it doesn't make any fundamental difference. And it's not just about sociology, but also about the psychology of the broad masses. It's always easier for people to keep everything as it is and not change anything, to just keep going out of inertia. If you don't believe me, let's go through it step by step. So, the ruling elite of the Russian Federation, by the way, that's not just the security forces, but also the state bureaucratic apparatus, oligarchs loyal to the Kremlin, and regional leaders of various levels, want to preserve and even increase their hard-earned assets and influence. Absolutely the entire Russian elite, like an addict, is completely dependent on the system created by Putin. After all, it gives them power, lots of money, and a chance to live without future worries. That's why any radical changes after Putin, whether it's limited democratization or a complete collapse, naturally threaten their positions and capital. That's why they'll prefer to keep Putin's dictatorship framework. It should also not be forgotten that the modern Russian state is a complex bureaucratic machine with well-established mechanisms, which are often interconnected in very intricate and not always easily understandable ways for the average citizen. This includes the FSB, the National Guard, the Investigative Committee, an extensive propaganda apparatus, and the huge army of mercenaries created by Putin, which will not be so easy to get rid of after the war with Ukraine ends. All of this, in the absence of real opposition, cannot simply be disbanded with the stroke of a pen. That's why anyone who takes Putin's throne, regardless of their last name, will find it much easier to keep this whole machine intact, carrying out only cosmetic purges. All the more so since, most likely, the new Tsar will come from the security services, more likely from the KGB than the army. As they joked during Andropov's era, it would become not the Central Committee, but the Communist Party's Cheka. Some hypothetical general or someone tied to the security services. Overall, in Russia's domestic policy, such an inertial scenario will definitely mean maintaining strict state control over society, which will inevitably be accompanied by repression, censorship, and massive propaganda. If anything changes in such a post-Putin reality, it will only be how resources are distributed, in favor of new favorites and people close to the new autocrat of all Russia. Ordinary Ivan won't get anything from this oil and gas feast. What's there to be surprised about? After all, as has always been the custom in Russia, dogs aren't allowed past the threshold. Scenario 2. Khrushchev or Gorbachev. And although fear of uncertainty is a powerful unifying factor around the new Tsar and the groups behind him, however, there remains one important problem that could lead to certain changes within the Russian Federation. This problem is purely economic in nature. Externally stable Putinism without Putin will inevitably face the fact that the Russian economy has been stagnant for many years while still retaining its raw material-based nature. In conditions of technological backwardness and continued sanctions, this will only mean a postponed crisis. There may not be any external symptoms, but the illness hasn't gone anywhere. Another significant problem is the rapidly growing economic dependence on China. The current Russian-Ukrainian war has already turned Beijing into the main market for Russian energy resources and, at the same time, the main supplier of military technologies, especially components for drones. Even experts who are quite loyal to the Kremlin warn about the dangers of excessive integration with China. Therefore, under such conditions, another scenario becomes likely, one that is somewhat different from the first. A scenario of limited liberalization, again with the fundamentals of the existing Putin system remaining in place. That is, if Putin's successor is forced to follow the path of Khrushchev or early Gorbachev. Or if we're really lucky, to pursue the Chinese reform model laid out by Deng Xiaoping. To put it simply, to make the Russian economy more competitive in the global market, but while keeping power in the same hands. Sometimes political analysts call this scenario a victory of technocrats or pragmatists over the security forces, although this approach isn't entirely objective. The new president doesn't necessarily have to be a technocrat or a liberal. For example, current Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin and Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin are among them. A former FSB general could also take the throne. It's just that his decisions might be somewhat different, more reasonable and calculated. After all, no matter how much Putin's eagles try to show off, many of them are suffering enormous losses from sanctions and international isolation. Therefore, if the new master of the Kremlin has relatively rational and pragmatic views, at least in the economic sphere, the Russian elite could easily initiate their own version of a thaw, at least to restore economic ties with the West and reduce the risk of personal sanctions. The fact that there are such people in Putin's inner circle right now is undeniable. People who basically don't care about their own people, but understand that even if they can't be friends with the West, at least stable, mutually beneficial trade is necessary. For example, Putin made the final decision on a large-scale invasion of Ukraine in September or October 2021 and shared his plans with a very small circle of people. Definitely fewer than 10 people, but just a few days later, this information reached CIA Director William Burns. And sometime in the latter part of that month, Biden held a meeting with the heads of US security agencies. And a week later, all the world's media were already writing about the planned invasion. The question is, who is the mole then? They are definitely not some old lady sweeping carpets in the Kremlin offices. Their own people leaked top-secret information to the West to stop Putin from attacking. However, they underestimated just how stubborn and slow-witted their main old czar really is. However, don't be too quick to celebrate. This scenario is much less likely than the previous one. Even if a Khrushchev 2.0 ends up at the helm in the Kremlin, it's almost certain that the security apparatus will try to sabotage any liberal reforms. Used to the era of Putin's permissiveness, the security elite will resist any attempts to limit their influence and access to resources, and then it becomes a question of who will prevail. The outcome could truly be unpredictable. However, in any case, the new leader, who does not possess the charisma or sacred status of his predecessor, will need his own support base. The simplest way to gain popularity within the country and recognition from abroad is to dismantle the most notorious elements of the previous policy. For example, releasing political prisoners, easing censorship, and establishing dialogue with the West. Many historians also emphasize a certain principle of historical cyclicality. They say that Russian history almost always develops according to the pendulum principle, meaning that a period of strict centralization and conservatism is followed by a period of reforms and modernization. For example, the liberal Alexander I was succeeded by Nicholas I, the gendarme of Europe, then again by the liberal Alexander II, who abolished serfdom, and after him came the conservative Alexander III. Although, in my opinion, this theory is really far-fetched. Overall, the likelihood of such a moderate leader coming to power can be considered average. However, it should be emphasized once again that such a leader will most likely act not out of any noble democratic convictions, but purely out of pragmatic calculation. Therefore, the initial reforms may be superficial, and their success will depend on whether the society, which has been pushed to the margins, can engage in the process before the political regime in the Russian Federation once again becomes entrenched. Scenario 3. Are we somehow worse than North Korea? This scenario is the direct opposite of the previous one and means that after Putin, an even harsher, more radical dictator will come to power. A sort of Stalin 2.0 or an equivalent of Kim Jong-un. It might seem, how could things get any harsher after what Russia is going through now? Is it even possible to tighten the screws even more? Believe me, it turns out you can, and you really can. First of all, you need to understand that over the years of the Russian-Ukrainian war, an influential group of radical conservatives has formed among the security forces, the so-called hawks. For example, this group includes Putin's aide and former personal bodyguard Alexei Dayumin, as well as Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Putin's longtime friend from the St. Petersburg backstreets, Nikolai Patrushev. These people, as well as many lower-ranking officials and security officers, have repeatedly stated that they consider the current leadership methods insufficiently decisive. They say that a full mobilization of the economy and society is necessary, as well as a shift to a wartime footing. That's how things stand. So if the new Tsar is hostile toward the West, a tougher domestic and foreign policy in Russia is almost guaranteed. By the way, there are still plenty of screws that can be tightened. For example, the death penalty could be reinstated. Technically, it's still in effect, but no one has been executed in Russia since 1996. At least not legally, because there's a moratorium in place. Although that didn't stop the same Prigozhin from carrying out sledgehammer killings of Wagner members who had messed up. And here, if the moratorium is lifted, they could easily stage show trials like in 1937 to intimidate society and the elites even more, to ensure obedience.
Как там говорится, бей своих, чтобы чужие боялись.
They can further strengthen internet censorship. This is the most promising direction, as experts call it, moving towards creating a sovereign Russian intranet. That is, to try to completely cut Runet off from the global network, to create their own version of a firewall. To implement their national messenger Max, which people are already jokingly calling the cop in your phone, and at the same time, to block as much as possible popular VPN services that allow people to bypass restrictions. By the way, guys, what's the correct way to say it, Max or Mach? Write it in the comments. You could also completely close the borders, like in the times of the USSR. You could introduce forced labor mobilization in certain industries. For example, in agriculture, where there aren't many people willing to go, except maybe for migrants from Central Asia. You could carry out mass nationalizations by simply seizing certain business assets, and some isolated cases are already happening. And you could also ramp up the propaganda of so-called traditional values, completely ban abortions and contraceptives, increase the role of orthodoxy and religion in general in education and the cultural sphere. In short, there's plenty of room to grow. Overall, the likelihood of a more brutal ruler coming to power in Russia is relatively high, especially if the transfer of power happens during an acute military crisis. It's in situations like this that the demand for a strong leader rises sharply, and there's always someone to fill that role. Just remember 1999 Chechnya and the mass apartment bombings. We also have a separate video about this. What future awaits Ukraine? Naturally, when analyzing all these options, a logical question automatically arises. What awaits Ukraine in each of these scenarios? After all, where are we in all of this? I'll tell you this. Each of the scenarios mentioned will directly depend on a single factor. Will there be a war at that moment, or will active hostilities cease? Most likely they will be frozen. In the case of the most obvious scenario, Putinism without Putin, if the war hasn't ended by that time, then with a high degree of probability it will continue further, with approximately the same intensity. The new Tsar simply won't dare to change course abruptly. All the more so because the war is a tool for consolidating the elites and distracting from internal problems. At the same time, tactical pauses for regrouping are possible at the front, but not full-fledged ceasefires. But if the war is still frozen during Putin's rule, his successor is unlikely to risk attacking right away. At the same time, he will definitely be building up forces for a possible attempt to strike back. There will definitely be a continuation of hybrid aggression, cyber attacks, and various attempts to destabilize Ukrainian politics from within. In this scenario, Ukraine remains under the so-called Israeli model, that is, a state of constant mobilization of society and the state. To put it simply, there will be a Cold War 2.0 between the two states, with a serious risk of a new hot phase. If moderate reformers and technocrats come to power, then Ukraine will have much more opportunities for normal, peaceful development. If the new leadership of the Russian Federation is oriented toward dialogue with the civilized West and the lifting of at least some sanctions, then the Kremlin will definitely face demands to end the war. Most likely, the fighting will be frozen along the current front line for an indefinite period. Don't even dream about the withdrawal of Russian troops from the occupied territories. No Russian leader would agree to this, not even the most pro-Western liberal Democrat. Voluntarily giving up captured territories would be political suicide for any Russian president. Such weakness would not be forgiven by not only the security hawks but also by the conservative Russian heartland. But if by the time of the power transition the war is already over, then events will continue to develop according to the same scenario. But since there will always be a risk of backsliding in the Kremlin, Ukraine will need to maintain and develop its powerful military-industrial complex, just in case. In any case, these options are the most ideal for Ukraine because they will not only open the way to real economic recovery, but also give the opportunity to fully integrate into the structures of the European Union and NATO. But if the Kremlin ends up with Putin squared, cubed, or even to the fourth power, then nothing good awaits Ukraine for sure. If the war is not frozen by the time of the power transition, the war will not only continue, but will intensify even more. It is almost guaranteed that a new mobilization will be announced in Russia, much larger and harsher than in 2022. And if the war is frozen, then the new Tsar will almost inevitably unfreeze it within the next few years. At least later, because an external enemy is simply necessary to provide the much-needed legitimacy. And by the way, I'm deliberately not considering the nuclear weapons factor, although we all need to keep it in mind. In any case, regardless of the scenario, the key factor for Ukraine remains maintaining internal agency and support from the West. Even during the much-praised thaw, Russian imperialism will not disappear instantly. It may simply go into a latent phase. It would be good if it stayed there. Not very cheerful conclusions. Thus, the most realistic scenario for Russia without Putin is a cosmetic change at the top while maintaining the Putin system. This forecast is confirmed by previous historical processes, the structure of those in power, and current expert assessments. Putinism is not built to outlive its creator. At least in the initial stage, inertia, development, this is the most likely short-term scenario for Russia. The elites will do everything possible to maintain the status quo for their own safety and to preserve their wealth. And although Putinism without Putin seems like the most logical option, there are still a number of so-called black swans that could disrupt it. First and foremost, this is the war in Ukraine and the confrontation with the West as a whole. A possible military defeat and ongoing sanctions pressure create a strain that even such a powerful system may not be able to withstand. Especially if less competent and less far-sighted leaders end up in Putin's seat. Constantly increasing military spending inevitably leads to higher taxes, primarily for small businesses, as well as to inflation. These are the very critical risk factors. Internal elite infighting, or as political scientists call it, rivalry among Kremlin factions, can also play a role. Putin has already been acting as the supreme arbiter, overseeing numerous power groups for more than a quarter of a century. Without his authority, hidden conflicts over the redistribution of power and property could escalate into an open phase. Moreover, any new leader or group will not have the same level of sacred support that has been built around Putin for decades. They will have to either increase terror or seek popularity through reforms, or at least imitate them. And just to make things absolutely clear, I want to emphasize this specifically. As unfortunate as it is to admit, Russia's transition to genuine Western-style democracy in the first years, and most likely even decades after Putin, seems the least likely scenario. The system is too deeply built around coercive control, political institutions function only for appearances, and civil society has either been pushed out of the country or is completely demoralized and disorganized. Therefore, in the long term, Russia faces a gradual transformation either toward a more rational authoritarianism like China or an even more closed dictatorship of the North Korean or Iranian type. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all the viewers. And thank you to the sponsors for your support. The channel is financially supported. Without you, it's hard to make videos like this.
Сложно. Всем пока.